Hello, and welcome to another episode of my Type 35 build. Parts for the car have started to make their way in, so today we get to shift gears, quite literally as a matter of fact, and focus on the front and rear axles of the car. Starting with the front, and roughly set into place for posterity's sake, is a 2-inch round quarter wall tubular steel drop axle, which sounds pretty big and heavy, but surprisingly, the thing only weighs 20 pounds. Sure, the original Bugattis had forged aluminum axles, and they may have weighed two-thirds, maybe half as much. Keeping weight down is important, but for being steel, I was shocked that it's as light as it is. The axle itself is a really nice piece. Smooth bends, nice welds, really clean surface finish. It's a 6-inch drop axle that, as it sets, is resting right at ride height relative to the frame and should provide a generous amount of suspension travel while keeping the car's stance nice and low. I could have gone with less drop, but it would have meant less up travel in the suspension, so it was a bit of a trade-off, especially when it comes to spring selection and getting the axle drop and the spring arch to match each other. But I think it's pretty close, and with a little bit of adjusting in the spring mounts, should come out spot on. You can really see how nice the bends are when you get up close, but the best part is the kingpin inclination. It sounds silly since all solid axle cars run some form of angle to the kingpin, but the original Type 35s didn't. And when you get down, you can see the angle the kingpin boss is at. So rather than driving around with the tires tipped out all wonky at the top, this car will have its tires pointed straight up. Inboard of the kingpin boss is a small block under the axle, which is roughly where the spring will be, but on top, not underneath. It looks a little naked without brakes and steering and springs, but between the two, it's actually the rear axle that got stripped. Weighing in at, well, a little more than 20 pounds, is an S197 Mustang 7.5-inch rear end. This is a really neat axle. It's a little ugly here, having just been rescued from the dismantler, where it languished for what appears to have been quite some time, but was chosen in part because of its light weight. Ford axle assemblies generally weigh in lower than their GM counterparts, and then the 7.5-inch Mustang rears actually come in at an additional 30 pounds or so lighter than the 8.8s. But it no more than made it into the garage before going on a diet itself. The bump stops, the track bar, the shock mounting brackets, and the counterweights were all removed. 5 pounds probably taken off the rear axle. They were superfluous anyway, so taking them off from the start makes mocking things up that much easier. And while weight was one of the reasons I chose this axle, from any of the number of axles I could have chosen from, I settled on this particular era of 7.5 because given the overall weight of the car and the power it'll have, this rear end will be plenty strong enough. Plus, Ford ran the pinion centered so the drive shaft will run straight down the middle of the car instead of cattywampus like it would have with a GM rear axle. It also had the least amount of bracketry to remove. The Camaro rear axle would have been cool because the torque arm style suspension of the original Bugattis could have been mimicked with it, but the Mustang axle was just cleaner looking out of the gate. And the rear suspension on this car is just gonna be awesome. I mean, the lower control arm brackets couldn't have lined up more perfectly. And really, just wait until you see the upper control arm and spring mounts. Lastly, the width of the axle was spot on for what I wanted. The S197s are actually quite a bit wider than the earlier Mustang axles and should balance out the width of the car in the rear so it looks more planted and less pigeon-toed. I never was a fan of the narrower rear track of the original Type 35s, which is the cool part about building your own car. You get to change and improve on things you don't like about the original car.